Okay, let's jump right into it. Within the first few verses that Marshall read today, we have two right in a row. One of them will probably be familiar, if not even a verse you could recite by heart, either in Hebrew and or in English. And the second one, less so. And I want to read the two of them, then ask you a question about them. All right, so if you're following from home, the text sheet went out in the Shabbat bulletin. If you just have a chumash in front of you, it's chapter 25 of Shmot, of Exodus, verse 8. The asu li mikdash, this is God commanding the Israelites, you shall make for me, I'm going to not translate this for a second, a mikdash, v'shachanti betocham, and I will live or dwell among them. It's an interesting shiur, but not the shiur I want to give right now. Why God says, build me a this and I will dwell among them. That's an interesting question. It doesn't say that I will dwell in it, but of them. That's the verse that many people know. You see that sometimes over in our own Kodesh in synagogues. It's kind of a slogan for spiritual gathering. And the next verse. Kechol asher ani mareh otcha. Everything, or just like everything that I show you, mareh is the causative, the he feel of ro'eh. So ro'eh is to see, mareh is to make someone else see, to show. Et tavnit hamishkan. And this is meaning the building shape, the pattern is translated here of the, I'm also going to untranslate this, Mishkan. Viet tavnit kol kelav, and the pattern of all of its implements. V'chein tasu. That's what you should do. Okay. Aside from the thing I pointed out before, that God asks to make an it, and then God says, I'm going to dwell in the them. Does anyone find anything curious about, in particular, this couplet of verses? I'm not looking at something which is odd within any verse, but the fact that one verse follows the next. Anything jump out at you as, or either because it's redundant or because it's inconsistent or anything like that? I don't want to lead the witness too much. Let's give a microphone that we'll pass around.
Why is it necessary to say v'chein tasu at the end of it?
Okay, good. So if in the beginning God has given a command, one would think that the command is self-evident. Why should God repeat the command at the end? V'chein tasu. Good. Not the one I was looking for, but that's good too. Anything else in comparing verses 8 and 9? Particularly the vocabulary. Okay, yeah.
Pronouns, right? So atsu, the atsu li mikdash, and let them make the mikdash, and then the next one is ani mareh otcha. I will show you singular at tavnit.
Okay, so we seem to be changing from singular to plural a lot. I'm asking you, plural, to make me a single thing, and I'm going to dwell in them, plural. And then later on, the ani mareh otcha is everything that I show you, singular, right? So it's got, where's the them? Yeah, this, I forgot which translation this is. I hate to critique. It's a bad translation because va'asuli is a command form. Make me a mikdash. But there's a them in the betocham. So there's a them, then a you singular. Alan, let's get the mic to Alan.
The object of what they're supposed to build has two different names.
Aha.
In verse 8, it's called Mikdash. In verse 9, it's Mishkan.
Okay, bingo, right? So if we read each verse on its own, it makes sense. If we assume that the thing that is being spoken about in verse 8 is also being spoken about in verse 9, the question we can ask is, what is it? What does God ask? What's the name of the thing? Is it a mikdash or is it a mishkan? Now, either that's a question about nothing. Sometimes there are synonyms, Rabbi. Sometimes you can have two words denoting the same thing. Or, as I'm going to posit in the next 18 minutes, the relationship between mikdash and mishkan which are often used somewhat interchangeably, but throughout Jewish history refer to very, very different objects, might say some of the most important things about our understanding about how we meet God and God meets us. When I say that the two words have been used to denote different things historically, what do I mean? What historically does the Mishkan mean? What structure?
Portable sanctuary in the wilderness.
The portable sanctuary in the wilderness. In fact, the very thing that is being commanded right now. At the beginning of Parshat Terumah, we've just finished Parshat Mishpatim. We had 10 commandments in Yitro. We had civil laws in Mishpatim. And now it has come time for God to say, oh, by the way, in addition to treating each other mentally and observing Shabbat, you need to build me a place where I can be among you. Traditionally, that is referred to as the Mishkan. And traditionally, what object or building does the word mikdash refer to?
The Beit HaMikdash.
Right, like the permanent one, right? So Mishkan is temporary, Mikdash is permanent, or it was permanent twice before the Babylonians and the Romans unpermanented it, okay? There's nothing about the word Mishkan that means temporary. There's nothing around the word Mikdash that means permanent, but those terms were used to describe either the one that the Israelites would break down, carry, and build, break down, carry, and build, not only, by the way, throughout the years of the Torah on the eastern side of the Jordan, but even when they crossed in the book of Joshua into the land of Canaan, and they established a polity there, it was not right away that they got to Jerusalem. In fact, to the extent we can historicize the notion of the Israelites crossing the Jordan River into the land of Israel, to the extent we can historicize the story of Moses, let's call it about 1200 BCE, although it's hovering in that kind of prehistory mode. We can absolutely historicize King David and the building of the first temple by his son Solomon. King David rules from about the year 1000 to about the 960s. That's not a myth. It's not hovering in myth. That's real. Okay, so there were a couple of hundred years or so that the descendants of those who came out of Egypt were living in the land of Canaan. They did not have a singular monarchy yet. In fact, they didn't even have monarchs for a while, right? They were prophets until it got to Saul, David's predecessor. But they worshipped, and they worshipped in one central place. And what was the name of the place that they worshipped at? The Mishkan, right? And it was in several different places, including in the town of Shiloh. Has anyone ever been to the town of Shiloh? Right? Shiloh is in the Shomron in the northern part of the West Bank. It's a lovely village and settlement. And if you go to Shomron, the sanctuary, the synagogue in Shomron, if you look at it from a distance, it is built according to what architectural blueprints? Parshat Terumah. It looks like the Mishkan. If you've ever seen an attempt at drawing what the Mishkan would look like, in fact, I think very end of the Eitz Chaim Chumash here, there are some drawings. It's going to take me too much time to figure out. Whoever finds the drawings, shout it out. There's an attempt to depict what the Mishkan might have looked like. I don't know where it is. 1520? Yeah, 1520. So at the bottom of 1520, if the next time you're in the Shomron and you want to visit Shul, that's what the Shul looks like, okay? That was the Mishkan. It was not converted into something called the Mikdash, the Beit HaMikdash, or Mikdash for short, until it was built as a permanent structure in Jerusalem by King Solomon. But again, those distinctions were different words used to describe two buildings in history, disconnected from the origin of the meaning, okay? Look at the source 2. This is Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Eruvin, page 2. It's actually, as some of you know, that Talmudic tractates begin on page 2. So page 2 is actually page 1. So this is when the first couple of lines of Masechet Eruvin, because it's page 2, side A. And the rabbis, in a context that is we don't need to get into, say, Ashkechan Mishkan De'ikri Mikdash. Sometimes we find that the Mishkan is referred to as the Mikdash, Mikdash De'ikri Mishkan. And sometimes the Mikdash is referred to as the Mishkan. What they're basically saying is, hey, reader, don't be so confused by the two verses we looked at. Yeah, it is referring to the same thing. Sometimes it's called Mikdash, sometimes it's called Mishkan. If those buildings the words refer to two different buildings, then maybe there's something about the word that represents why one building was called one thing and one building was called another. But if the same word is used to describe the same building, which is what we're seeing in our verses and in Eruvin, then it might be that something about the word is saying something about what's supposed to happen anytime we're building a space where we're supposed to meet God. Is your hand up, Elon? Okay. So let's take a look at some of the roots itself. If I had to ask you the root kadosh, kiddush, kedusha, mikdash, kiddushin, kadosh, 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 in your varied Jewish education, what do you think that root normally means? Holy. Almost everyone said holy, right? You might say sacred, sanctified, right? It's the most common way of mistranslating the root kuf daled shin. We'll get to that in a second. And if I said to you, what is the basic meaning of the root shin kuf nun, shchuna, shachen, shchina, to dwell, to live near, right? A shachen is a neighbor. A shchina is God's feminine indwelling, right? A shchuna is a neighborhood, okay? Let's hold on that and let's see if those who've done most amount of research into what biblical words and rabbinic words mean agree. So look at source 3. These are a couple of entries from the authoritative dictionary written, I think it was completed in the early 1900s by Rabbi Marcus Jastrow. It's an unbelievable work, especially in an era pre-computers, how he finds literally every root used in all of rabbinic and biblical literature, tells you what it means in every form, and gives you little footnotes before there were hyperlinks to different places where it's used. It's impossible to conceive of how hard it was and how much he had to master to make this dictionary. Okay, his entry for Mishkan. So some of these abbreviations are hard to follow. The M period means masculine. It's a masculine noun. BH. Anyone know what BH stands for? Biblical Hebrew, right? From the biblical Hebrew. What did I miss? Baruch Hashem, yeah. Because Jastrow is primarily a dictionary of rabbinic Hebrew. He says it comes from the biblical Hebrew root shachan. When Jastrow puts something in italics, that means the definition. Everything else are examples. So shachan is from the biblical root shachan. And what does mishkan mean? If it's a lowercase mem, haha, it means a dwelling. And if it's an uppercase mem, it means a particular kind of dwelling, the temporary sanctuary of the desert, the tabernacle. Okay. In fact, the next thing, Erub 2a, that's actually the previous source above. That's Eruvin, page 2a. That's the exact source that we just before. So he, in his dictionary, brings us to the Talmudic source that we were looking at. Okay. Now go to the next one, source 4. This is the entry not for the noun mishkan, but for the verb shachan. Okay, so he says, first of all, biblical Hebrew, view, look at, compare it to the root kaf vav nun, kun or kon, and he says, what does the word mean? It means to dwell or to rest. And it gives you a couple of forms. In what's called the PL form, lishakein, which is sometimes it's an intensive form, and sometimes it's a causative form. In this root, it's a causative. Lishakein means to make something else dwell, to cause to dwell, or to establish. He quotes the Talmud from Brachot, Mi sheshikein et shemo hu yashkin. The very one who made God's own name to dwell amongst you, that one will bring peace. Will yashkin shalom, the word shalom isn't here, but that's the next word, will allow peace and love and brotherhood to be among you. Okay? And similarly, when it's in what's called the hif'il, which is another causative form, it means to cause to dwell. Yashkinu lashchina. They, the righteous ones, who because of the way they live, they cause God to be shochen, to be dwelling amongst them. Okay? So, according to Jastrow, in biblical and rabbinic Hebrew, the Mishkan is a place of living. Who's living? Maybe God, right? Maybe God, because it doesn't seem to suggest that the Israelites are living there, But when we say that maybe God is living there, we start running into a language problem because we also don't imagine that God lives anywhere, right? And we don't imagine that God is limited to a particular place on earth. But something or someone is dwelling in whatever the Mishkan is. Again, Mishkan doesn't mean temporary, it means a place of dwelling. Okay, now let's look at what Jastrow says about Mikdash. So we'll do the same thing. First look at the noun and then the verb in source 5. In Mikdash, masculine noun again, biblical Hebrew from the root kadash, and he says, what does Mikdash mean? A sanctuary, and especially Beit HaMikdash, the sanctuary, right? The Jerusalem temple. Look what he says very interestingly, and remember, Jastrow is a linguist. He's not writing a commentary on the Torah. He knows the Torah, but he's not offering what he's saying as a way of commenting on the Torah. He's just telling you what words mean. He says, contradicting or contradistinction to Mishkan, the tabernacle. So what he says is that the word mikdash specifically means the permanent temple in Jerusalem, not to be confused with the Mishkan, the temporary dwelling in the desert, even though Parshat Terumah confuses them. Even though in our Parsha, both words are used to describe the same thing. And then he also, in this spot, quotes the very thing that we saw above, Ashkachan Mishkan Ikre Mikdash. We find that sometimes the tabernacle is called Mikdash and vice versa. And now, what does Jastrow say the root kadash means? Interestingly, his first definition for what the root means is not holy, is not sacred. Kadash, biblical Hebrew, to be cut off. That is not something we normally talk about when we're saying what the Kedusha is. Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. God is cut off, cut off, cut off. Doesn't make sense, right? You under a chuppah are going to go through Kiddushin. You're going to be cut off from each other. It doesn't really make sense. And yet, according to Jastrow, that's what the root means, to be separated, to be distinct. Interestingly, look later on in that bracket, compared to parash. Parash means to pull yourself away. What was the name of the caste or the subset of Jews who became the rabbis in the Hellenistic period? In
Pharisees.
The Pharisees.
Erushim.
The Pharisees, as opposed to the Sadducees. Sadducees is a bastardization of that Sadukim. The Pharisees are from the Hebrew prushim. Why were they prushim? Because they pulled away. They were distinct. They were ascetics, right? They were actually trying to make themselves kadosh, not kadosh in the sense of holy, but kadosh in the sense of being removed and unlike all others. By the way, I think it's actually a better way of rendering the word, and it works for Shabbat, and it even works for marriage, right? When we say Shabbat is holy, it doesn't really help us understand what Shabbat is, because what does holy mean, right? When we say Shabbat is distinct, all of a sudden we're understanding what our obligations are. We're supposed to treat the day and treat ourselves on that day in a way that is entirely distinguished from the days before it. Right? That actually begins to make some sense. I actually think that kiddushin for a married couple or a couple getting engaged being described not as you're building something holy together. I've got nothing wrong with the idea of people building something holy together. I just don't think what the word means. What did it mean in the ancient rabbinic world when he, the groom, was mikadesh otah? It wasn't saying you'll be my holy wife. It was saying that your relationship with me is separate and distinct from your relationship with anyone else. It was fidelity. It was troth, right? The first of the two ceremonies under a chuppah, which we actually think of as the wedding ceremony, but it's really first you get engaged. The ring ceremony under chuppah is the engagement ceremony, even though in our modern world you've already gotten engaged. But the first set of blessings in the ring ceremony is an engagement ceremony. There are two Hebrew words that describe that engagement ceremony, erusin and kiddushin. They're synonyms. The reason why it means kiddushin is because he was saying to her in ancient rabbinic law, you are giving me your troth, your fidelity. I'm giving you in exchange for that a ring. In modern weddings, when I do two rings at a modern wedding ceremony, which I almost always do, it didn't used to be the norm, now it is, I never have it be an exchange of rings. I don't say you're each giving a ring for the other one's ring. In fact, I separate the two ceremonies by the reading of the ketubah. You each are giving a ring in exchange for troth, the other one's promise of fidelity, right? In exchange for the other one saying, I'm going to be kadosh or kiddusha to you, singular to you in a way that I am with no one else. That is a distinctness, and I think it actually makes better sense than holiness. Okay? So later on, he says it also means to become pure, sacred, holy. But on a basic level, it's something about being different or other. And then he tells us what it means in the PL to sanctify, and gives us a couple examples. Okay, so if we push it back into our verse, if we think that Jastrow was right, and a Mishkan is a place of dwelling, whose dwelling? Paul has suggested maybe God's, but we don't know. And a Mikdash is a place, let's not use the word holiness, but a place of separateness, of distinctness, of being different. What about that building that the Israelites were building in the desert suggested that it should be a place for both? In what way was that early place of prayer and worship and gathering a place of Mikdash and a place of Mishkan, such that both words could be used to describe it, using Jastrow's definitions of the words? From Jastrow's definition of the words, what is kadosh about that building? If we can't use the word holy to describe it.
It's separate and apart, and if I remember correctly, that the Jews weren't able to, the Ploni ben Ploni wasn't allowed to enter into the Mikdash. It was only going to be the priests that were doing it, so it was separate and apart.
Okay, so we're getting somewhere. What we're saying about this building, this Mikdash, is that wherever it is placed and it's traveled, the moment you walked into its threshold, you were or you should have been transported. Why to this day does it drive me still a little bit crazy as a father and as a rabbi that the notion of bigdei Shabbat, of dressing appropriately for shul, has kind of been downgraded in a generation. I see this as I'm wearing a hoodie. But underneath my hoodie, I'm actually yes, I'm actually torn on the very issue, because there's a part of me that would like our shul to be more like kind of an Israeli style, where khakis and a white shirt would be just fine for shul. And I don't like having to put on a wool suit in the summer for bar mitzvah. But I do like the notion of the children and the adults in our community, when they walk into this building, that the crossing over of that threshold is demanding something different of them. Because wherever this building would be, because it is a mikdash on some level, and therefore it is a place of separateness and distinctness, that it is supposed to awaken a change in our comportment and a change in our behavior. Turn the page. It's this Hasidic commentary that actually was the engine for this whole teaching, because I came upon it first, and then I did some back research onto the words. I've been teaching from him a lot recently. His name is the Shem Mishmuel, which is an interesting name of his book. Rabbi Avram Bornstein, I think he was the second Sukkotchover Rebbe. It was not a particularly famous dynasty of Hasidic Rebbes, but it is one. And as I said the last time I taught him, what I like most about the Shem Mishmuel is that, unlike a lot of other Hasidic texts, he's very accessible. And if you have, you don't need to have full expertise in all the layers of Hasidic mysticism to understand his commentary on the Torah. And he's also saying something interesting. Okay, this is what the Shem Mishmuel says on our verse. First, he quotes that source we've now seen several times. I brought it to you, and then Jastrow referenced it. Mishkan ikre mikdash, mikdash ikre mishkan. Sometimes the Mishkan is called the mikdash. Sometimes the mikdash is called the Mishkan. Again, that's the Talmud's way of saying it's not just the case that those two words mean two different buildings. One temporary, as it was traveling through the land of through the Jordan and the land of Israel, and the other one permanent. It's actually two words that can both refer to the same thing. And this is where he gets to his kind of theology of presence, which I find very compelling. Mikdash nikra mitzad Yisrael. When we use the word mikdash, we're using it to say something about the people who are inside of it, the people of Israel, right? Shehem mitkadshim, because they make themselves kadosh. Don't read it as holy here. Read it the way Jastrow did. It's called a mikdash because when a Yisrael walks into it, he or she recognizes that they are obligated to be mitkadesh in that space, to act differently, to be different. Uforshim, that's that same root like the Pharisees, and to pull back, to separate, to be singular from hachomriut, from the root chomer, which means material things, right? Again, this is something that we sometimes belie in the modern synagogue life, particularly when there's a culture of dressing to the nines and dressing to the nines on our most sacred days, like the Yamim Noraim, when the Jewish tradition would say, dress down, put on a kittel, put on a simple piece of clothing. You know, cultures have their own momentum, and in a lot of places, including here on some level, there is a dive towards chomriyut, towards material things when we go to shul. He's saying, why is it called a mikdash? Because ideally it's a place where you separate yourself from the things which outside matter. What matters out there? Bling and cash and the access that money can buy. What matters in here? You're being able to pull away from that. V'hu dibuk Yisrael ba'avihem. That is the essential quality of the way in which Yisrael, the Jewish people, experience a clinging, dibuk. The modern Hebrew word devek is glue. A gluing together, ba'avihem, with their heavenly father, heavenly parent. Mimata lamala, from up down to up. So the first thing he said is, why is it a mikdash? It's a mikdash because of our obligation. We walk into it, and from our perspective, it's a mikdash because if we are successful in being mitkadesh, then we are sending the vibes up. For the moment, even though we imagine that God is everywhere, Avinu Shabbat is up there, and our work in this space, in this room tonight and every night, is to be mikudash or mitkadesh, and to send up that intention and that focus upward. That's why it's mikdash. And why is it called mishkan then? Mishkan nikra mitzad Hashem yitbarach. From God's perspective, it's a mishkan. From our perspective, it's a mikdash obligating us. From God's perspective, it's a mishkan, going back to what Paula said before, hashochen b'toch amo Yisrael. Because if we do the right thing in this space, there's a chance that God will descend and be shochen in the mishkan with God's people Israel. V'hu hadibuk milamata limata. That's the vertical down clinging, and it comes in response to the vertical up, right? And it's almost to be saying, it's only a mishkan if you do what you need to do to make it a mikdash. If you don't treat the space as a mikdash, don't expect any shechina. If you don't do what the space requires of you, sending the power up, then why would the power ever come down? V'haya hamakom hahu, and that very spot, meaning the spot in wherever the Mishkan stood, the Mishkan Mikdash stood, makom chibur, that is the place of connection, of fusing together. L'chaber means to connect. It's from the same root that makes the word friend, chaver. Mimata lamala, from down to up. First, it must start with us. Umilmala lamata, and from up down in response. Al kain hu nikra b'shnei hashemot. That's why it's called two names. What I love about this is, first of all, it makes the verses in the beginning of Parshat Terumah all of a sudden not just redundant, it's so easy to say synonyms. So forget synonyms. We're talking about a massive system that allows or asks the Jew to expect of himself or herself a certain comportment, a certain way of being, a certain pulling away from everything else that matters out there. And if that is how you're able to handle yourself, there's a chance that the Shekhinah will do some shochening, and you have the power of turning it from a mikdash to a mishkan. I think it also, this notion adds and reduces pressure. And then I'd like to hear responses to it. It adds pressure because it means that God doesn't appear unless we've invited God's presence with our behavior. And that's an enormous expectation, to say that God would be absent from the world but not for us. So that adds pressure. Here's why it reduces pressure. You've got one job as a Jew when you come to shul. It's not to follow along even necessarily. It's certainly not to chat with the person next to you. It's not to judge how well the other person lanes or davens. It's not to to critique the darshan, right? It's not even necessarily to finish all the tefillot. Your job is to turn yourself into someone who's mukdash, slightly elevated, slightly separated from everything else. That's your primary job. If you do that, everything else will follow, and the religious experience will unfold. So, from a Hasidic way of looking at prayer life, this makes a lot of sense, right? Like turn out all the noise, come into the space, and be slightly pulled back. It's not pulled back from society, but pulled back from what society says is important out there, because different things are important here. Let me pause here for a second. Thoughts, comments, reactions before we read one more source?
It's really interesting because it predates, look how old this is, right, 19th century. And so I see it as very relational, that demand from us in that separation. And I keep thinking of Havdalah, right, in those separations and so the language is really appropriate, like the kadosh and the chol.
Yeah.
So it's and it also makes me think about being really present, right? Just like for me, like when I light Shabbat candles, it's like, okay, that switch turned off, some other thing opened up. And so the idea of walking into shul with that going on as well is really inviting. Feels like an invitation.
It's also, thank you, Paul, for that. And it's relational in terms of our relationship with God. It's also relational internal to the self, because it says almost, if you're not having the religious experience that you think you should be having, it's so easy to say, well, why didn't God visit me today? It's much more important to say, what have I not yet done to invite God here? Right? Rabbi Mike Cummins, who is a Reform rabbi, does a lot of writing on prayer, says that every negative prayer experience is your fault. Right? It's really wonderful. It just says it, like, if you haven't had, and it's not about expertise. It's not about whether or not you can say the words well. If you have not had the prayer experience that you thought you were going to have, it's on you. It's because you haven't invested, you haven't become the director of your own prayer. Or that line, I think this is Oscar Wilde, something's boring me, I think it's me, right? So if your prayer is boring you, okay, it's probably you, probably not God, as it were. Irv?
It's what I learned, not just about prayer, but about most things in life, is what you put in, period.
Yeah.
Once I discovered that I enjoy singing the service, the callback style stuff, it became a major benefit, period. Good. But this makes a lot of sense.
So what Irv is saying, this is kind of a thick and sophisticated way of saying that oft-used aphorism, that you get out of something what you put into it, but in a very particular way in terms of what your expectations should be when you go to shul. Let's look at the last one about Abraham Joshua Heschel. We could spend 2 hours on just these two paragraphs. We're not going to. He's adding a layer here. I'll let it speak for itself. The mythical mind would expect that after heaven and earth have been established, God would create a holy place. Right? So you would think that if you believe in a world in which God wants to be in relation with the Jewish people, with any people, that once the basics have been done, right, God would make something happen here, a holy mountain, a holy spring, whereupon a sanctuary is to be established. Yet it seems as if to the Bible, it is holiness in time, the Sabbath, which comes first. And by the way, it does, right? Well before, chronologically in the Torah, we're asked to build a Mishkan. We're asked to build a Shabbat, right? The building of the Mishkan comes afterwards. As Heschel's about to say, everything we just described is a concession to our weakness and our inability to make something holy or different without the space. When history began, there was only one holiness in the world, holiness in time. When at Sinai the word of God was about to be voiced, a call for holiness in man was proclaimed. Thou shalt be unto me a holy people. Am Kadosh. So first, time itself was holy, then humanity became holy. It was only after the people had succumbed to the temptation of worshiping a thing. We don't know how to do holiness or separateness without something tangible, a golden calf, that the erection of a tabernacle, Mishkan, of holiness, I think it should be in space, was commanded. The sanctity of time came first, the sanctity of man came second, and the sanctity of space last. Time was hallowed by God, space, the tabernacle, was consecrated by Moshe. It's almost, he's not responding directly to the Sukkot Rebbe, but it's almost if he's saying, even if the Sukkot Rebbe is right, ideally we wouldn't even need a synagogue, right? Muslims pray anywhere, right? Anywhere they are they're their own walking mishkan. They put down a rug, or if they don't have it, they don't do it. They don't put it down, and they beckon God wherever they are. It's not that Jews don't do that, but we don't generally do that, right? Jews who are committed to praying regularly, for the most part, try to find a place to pray, right? I certainly prayed on the side of the road, but it's not the primary place that we pray. It's almost as if we need Pilch Hall, we need the sanctuary, right? And we need a minyan, right? And the Sukkot would say, yes, and you need to ask of yourself something specific when you go to that place so that God can be dwelling inside it. But Heschel's saying, ideally, the thing that is the mikdash, that is asking something different of you, is a concept independent of a room, and therefore the ability to beckon God to be within that moment is also independent of a GPS coordinate. It should be something that we don't need a building to do, right? Now, I'm clearly not saying we don't need a synagogue. The way our Jewish society is set up, we very much need so. But at the very least, we can try to treat the synagogue and treat ourselves in the synagogue in a way that corresponds to what the Sukkot Rebbe says, and then remind ourselves occasionally that even this is a concession. And if we really want to get back to how the original notion of Kedusha was meant to be in our tradition, it would be to say that every possible space that we're in is a place in which we can expect ourselves to be kadosh, and then hope in response God will be shachin, will dwell amongst us. Shabbat shalom.